Well, ladies and gentlemen, welcome, and thank you all for making the time on this beautiful spring day in Washington, D.C. to be here with us. My name is Brian Finley. I'm the president and CEO here at the Stimson Center. Since 9/11, I think it is safe to say that much of what Americans know and understand about the country of Afghanistan has been filtered through the prism of our military operations in the region. And despite, sadly, promising signs of the past, I think it's quite clear that the security situation in Afghanistan is regrettably once again deteriorating. And we have seen a number of tragic attacks, even in Kabul, at the university, at the hospital, at one of the hospitals, over the course of the past month or two. The status of operations in Afghanistan, I think, were quite clearly a notable talking point throughout the campaign, and now President Trump, as we know, has launched a number of reviews of U.S. policy in Afghanistan for the Defense Department, from the intelligence agencies. But of course, I think it is, in order to understand the rather vexing challenges on the ground in the region, we need to take a wider perspective, wider certainly than just U.S. military operations in and of themselves, or the security situation in and of itself. And so I think as we consider prospective policy solutions for Afghanistan moving forward, I really cannot think of anyone better to help us do that than Ambassador Richard Olson. Ambassador Olson has, of course, had a distinguished career of public service, most recently as U.S. Special Representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan. Ambassador, thank you very much for being here to help us, help walk us through this discussion, and even more importantly, for your more than 35 years of public service to the country. Ambassador Olson will be joined on the dais, and is joined on the dais, by Shamila Chowdhury of the New America Foundation. Shamila herself has a distinguished career of public service as well, including as Director for Pakistan and Afghanistan on the National Security Council. Shamila, thank you for being here. And my only remaining task is to introduce our very own Samir Lalwani. Samir is the Deputy Director of our South Asia programming here at the Stimson Center, and also serves as a senior associate. He is a superstar on these issues for us. And with that, Dr. Lalwani, I turn the dais over to you, sir.
Okay, so just a few bits of housekeeping here. So first, thanks to Brian for convening this, and also to my colleagues, Richard Ponzio and Michael Crepon, for helping to organize this event today. And thanks to you all for joining us, both here and online, for those watching the live stream. Very much appreciate your engagement in the subject. If you haven't already read Ambassador Olson's New York Times article from last week, it was all on your chairs. I encourage you to take a look at it. We're privileged to have Ambassador Olson here, along with Shamila Chowdhury, both very seasoned experts in this area we're about to discuss today. Let me just give you a brief order of operations of what we're going to be doing today. I'll be introducing Ambassador Olson. He'll offer some prepared remarks. Our discussant, Shamila Chowdhury, will offer some comments and challenges, and then we'll open it up to Q&A, and I'll try to start with Q&A specifically for any press today, and then we'll open up to the general audience. Again, this is all on the record, both the public remarks as well as the discussion. I'd ask you that you all take a moment to please turn off your cell phones right now so we don't have any disruptions or distractions during the event. If you're going to be tweeting or doing any social media with the event, I encourage you to use the hashtag StimsonToday. And with that, let me introduce Ambassador Olson. So as Brian said, Ambassador Olson has served in the U.S. Foreign Service for almost 35 years, retiring with the rank of Career Minister in November of 2016. He was the U.S. Special Representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan from November 2015 to November 2016. Prior to that, he was Ambassador to Pakistan from 2012 to 2015. He also served as the Coordinating Director for the Development and Economic Affairs Unit at the U.S. Embassy in Kabul from 2011 to 2012, and was U.S. Ambassador to the United Arab Emirates from 2008 to 2011. He's also been Deputy Chief of Mission at the U.S. Mission to NATO. He served in Mexico, Uganda, Tunisia, Saudi Arabia, Ethiopia, and Iraq. Ambassador Olson is a recipient of a number of awards, including the Secretary of State's Distinguished Service Award, a Presidential Distinguished Service Award, the Secretary of State's Award for Public Outreach, the State Department's Superior Honor Award 3 times, the Secretary of Defense's Exceptional Civilian Service Award for his service in Iraq, and he was also awarded the Medal of Wazir Akbar Khan by President of Afghanistan, Ashraf Ghani. And so with that, I introduce Ambassador Olson.
Thanks very much, Samir, and thank you, Brian, for the very kind introduction, and thanks to Stimson for hosting us today. Commentary on the war in Afghanistan has become a counsel of despair, labeling it the forever war, the never-ending war, and the forgotten war. Pundits have narrowed our policy choices to the unacceptable, cutting our losses and allowing terrorists to claim the ungoverned space, and the marginally less acceptable, a long war in which some level of foreign troops buck up the Afghan regime for a generation. General Nicholson's recent call for a modest troop increase to prevent a deteriorating stalemate has generated another discussion about troop levels, to the extent it has generated any discussion at all, rather than a review of our broad objectives and how to achieve them. I would like to take a step back and look at what our options in Afghanistan truly are and where we are headed over the longer term. It seems to me that there are in principle 4 broad courses of action available to us. 2 are extremely unrealistic, but I'll put them out there for theoretical reasons, and 2 are plausible as policy. The first option, we could, in principle, cut our losses, withdraw our forces entirely from Afghanistan, continue to prop up the Afghan government with civilian and some security assistance, and live with the consequences. This approach, while undoubtedly popular with some elements of a war-weary populace, would ignore the lessons of history and replay the events of 1989, when the U.S. withdrew its interest from the region at the end of the Soviet occupation, and from there we can draw an almost direct line to the events of 9/11. Such a policy would almost certainly result in the reemergence of ungoverned spaces and the resurgence of al-Qaeda, Daesh, and an unholy stew of other militants. While in principle we could continue to provide assistance to the government, this cynical ex-Foreign Service officer believes that our money tends to follow our troops, and when our troops leave, the money goes too. This despite the valiant efforts of Secretary Mattis and others to preserve funding for diplomacy. This policy of cutting our losses is a very bad option. Were we to pursue it, we would almost certainly have to go back again under less favorable circumstances. The second option, we could in principle surge our forces, presumably this time without the constraint of artificial timelines. In theory, this would allow us to truly defeat our enemies, or at least convince them they cannot wait us out. However, we would still face the problem of Taliban safe havens in Pakistan. Counterinsurgency theorists tell us that the record of defeating insurgencies that have the advantage of a foreign safe haven is a grim one. And as someone with considerable personal experience on this score, I think convincing Pakistan to effect a strategic shift is wishful thinking. And please remember that Pakistan controls our airlines of communication into Afghanistan, so ultimately the military leverage flows to their advantage. Finally, and this is not my area of expertise, but I don't think the American people are particularly keen on another large-scale adventure in Afghanistan. No one is actually proposing a surge, so I think this is a purely theoretical option. The third option, it seems to me, would be to have us maintain a garrison presence in Afghanistan conducting counterterrorism operations and the train, advise, and assist mission for the foreseeable future. We would continue to harden the Afghan state, and especially the Afghan defense and security forces. Given the scale of this project, it would entail decades. In other words, this is a long war, a generational commitment to some modest level of troops and robust assistance. It is apparently the policy course we are on, although I'm not sure that choice has been articulated to the American people. I am personally somewhat skeptical about the ability of our democracy to maintain an open-ended military commitment in such a challenging environment. And when a serious military challenge in other areas, I suspect DoD will be under pressure to reduce its commitments in a landlocked Central Asian country. But as a policy, this option is plausible and coherent. The fourth option is to pursue a political settlement. That is, to encourage the Afghan government and the Taliban to settle their longstanding differences in a manner that is acceptable to the U.S. and the international community while continuing to support the Afghan state. You might have guessed by now that I'm a proponent of the fourth option. So let me make the strategic case for reconciliation. This case begins with the premise that we as the United States have no fundamental quarrel with the Taliban. We took military action against the regime beginning in October of 2001 because it was allowing its territory to be used by al-Qaeda. Much as we disliked the Taliban regime of the 1990s, it never threatened us directly, nor did it seek to impose its medieval vision outside of Afghanistan. To engage in counterfactual analysis, had the Taliban handed over Osama bin Laden, it is safe to say that there would have been no need for a war. Of course, there has been a war that has lasted 16 years. But fundamentally, the core issue remains the same: whether Taliban-controlled territory would be used by terrorists to launch attacks against the homeland. There have been indications, not really more than hints, over the years that the Taliban might be prepared to abandon its relationship with al-Qaeda in return for some measure of international respectability. This alone offers a basis for serious discussion. If the international community can get solid arrangements going well beyond mere assurances that Afghanistan's territory would not be used as a base against us, surely that would remove the main need for continuing troop presence and for the international element of the conflict. Secondly, there is the regional dimension. But first, let me say that my belief is at core the conflict in Afghanistan is a civil war driven by internal conflicts. While much of official Washington dates the beginning of Afghan troubles to the December 1979 Soviet invasion, in fact, the USSR's intervention, a criminally stupid one, was to involve itself in an ongoing civil war that had been underway for some time in response to the Sour Revolution of April 1978. In my view, this nearly 4-decade-long Afghan conflict is fundamentally one between rural traditionalists and modern urbanizers, with the international community having taken different stands on those issues and different sides during the course of the 4 decades. Tensions between these sectors has been a factor in Afghan life since at least the rule of Shah Amanullah in the 1920s. Arguably, it is a historic dynamic throughout the Islamic world and perhaps more broadly, since, as Professor Barfield reminds us, it was first described by Ibn Khaldun in the 14th century, and his model still works pretty well for Afghanistan. But despite the fundamentally domestic nature of the dispute, the conflict has been prolonged and exacerbated by outsiders. Most prominent, but hardly alone, has been Pakistan, which nurtured the Taliban in the early 90s, supported their regime after 96, and has given them sanctuary for the past 16 years. We could spend hours on this aspect of the conflict, but suffice to say that despite heavy U.S. pressure and significant blandishments, Pakistan has never abandoned the policy of countenancing the Taliban's use of its territory against its Western neighbor. I am convinced from bitter personal experience that they will not abandon the Taliban because for the Pakistani establishment, Afghanistan policy is about geostrategic maneuvering against India. And since the establishment views India as the existential threat, all measures against the eastern neighbor are acceptable. To me, this is the fundamental reason for pursuing a policy of reconciliation. That the Taliban is backed by a nuclear weapons state is an exceedingly unpleasant fact, but like all unpleasant facts, one that needs to be factored into our policy. We cannot wish it away. Another unpleasant fact: our war in Afghanistan is entirely supported by an air bridge over Pakistani territory and to some extent by ground supply through Pakistan. We can't supply our troops through Iran. I doubt we can supply them through the Russian-dominated North, given the state of our relationship with Russia. So even if we take away the nuclear issue, the leverage flows towards Pakistan. This means that any long war policy is, as the Israelis would say, simply mowing the grass. That is, a conflict of attrition against a virtually inexhaustible supply of recruits. While Pakistan's behavior is in a class of its own for cynicism, it is not unique. Iran and Russia have played an unhelpful role, and their interventions are increasing. When Mullah Mansour was killed outside Quetta, he was traveling from Iran. The Iranians have admitted to contact with Taliban. Secretary Mattis pointed out last week that the Russians may be supporting the Taliban, a trend that has been underway for some time. When I was the special representative, I raised this with my Russian counterpart in Moscow, not to any great effect. While there are no doubt many sources of Russian conduct, a key element is that they and the Iranians do not believe in American staying power. They look at our somewhat precarious geostrategic situation and assume, like the Taliban, that they can wait us out. Moreover, Moscow has seen the logic of the situation and appears to be pushing its own political efforts. In December, it hosted a meeting purposely excluding the U.S. to discuss reconciliation. While this no doubt reflects some pique at having been excluded, in Moscow's view, from the quadrilateral process and a reflection of overall gamesmanship with the United States, we should recognize that the region is likely to see a negotiated political settlement as a superior option and will back whoever seems to be succeeding in that arena. This is an area where American leadership would make a difference, and the absence of American leadership will lead to a deterioration of our position. Let me briefly address the military situation to the extent I can. General Nicholson has characterized our position as heading towards stalemate, absent increased force levels. And the recent fall of Sangin suggests that at a minimum, this will be another tough fighting season. I support General Nicholson's call for more troops for reasons I will get into later, but I believe, again, because of the safe havens, that some form of military stalemate is almost inevitable. And it is worth remembering that the Taliban, as a primarily rural group, will perceive themselves to be winning if they hold broad swaths of countryside, as they increasingly do. The Afghan government holds the cities and the population centers, but there's an asymmetry between how each side sees its relative strength, and, I suppose, whether it's winning. Finally, it is necessary to mention Daesh, ISIL, or ISIS, or whatever you want to call it. The genesis of Daesh in Afghanistan is from the remnants of the Pakistani Taliban that were pushed out of Fatah during Operation Zarb-e-Azb, and they broke away from their allegiance to the Afghan Taliban for what they perceived to be a betrayal by the Afghan Taliban, who, after all, did not go to war with Pakistan when Pakistan went to war on the Pakistani Taliban. The emergence of Daesh further complicates an already messy military and political situation, but it may over time increase pressure on the Taliban. The Taliban have fought Daesh, and they may face further pressure from their enclaves, the Daesh enclaves. So that is my argument for a political settlement. Perhaps the question is, what would a reconciliation process actually look like, and what steps could be taken? The first step is one that has already been rehearsed a few times. A Taliban office should be opened, most likely in Doha, Qatar, in return for a publicly acknowledged peace process with the Afghan and U.S. governments. We came close to achieving this outcome in the summer of 2013, but the Taliban overreached by hoisting their flag and putting up signage labeling the office as representing the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan. The Karzai and U.S. governments rightly rejected these symbolic trappings of an embassy, and the deal collapsed. But all parties, including the Qataris especially, have every incentive to avoid a repeat of this debacle, which suggests that the deal might be resurrected if there were active American diplomacy on this issue. A more subtle challenge, at least for the Obama administration, was the view that after the conclusion of combat operations in 2014, we were not legally a party to the conflict. This would seem to fly in the face of the reality of our military involvement in Afghanistan, and naturally the Taliban see it as a subterfuge. There is no need to buy the entire Taliban argument about the issue of foreign troop withdrawals having to be resolved before moving to domestic issues. Clearly, that would remove the Afghan government's principal point of leverage. But the U.S. does need to accept that it is a party to the conflict. In my view, it needs to at least be prepared to discuss the possibility of troop withdrawals in a phased manner that allows for confidence-building measures to proceed. In the view of the emergence of Daesh, I think it is not impossible that the Taliban might eventually accept some residual U.S. military presence. Certainly, any discussion of withdrawal would need to be very carefully calibrated and coordinated with our Afghan allies. The core of any peace process, however, needs to be among Afghans and about their political settlement. This portion of the dialogue must truly be Afghan-led and Afghan-owned. The Afghan government, with the support of the U.S. and the international community, has laid out 3 end conditions that must be met: cessation of violence, a break with al-Qaeda and other international terrorist groups, and the acceptance of the Afghan constitution, including its provisions with regard to minorities and women. These are, in effect, red lines, but they leave ample space for negotiation. The key problem here is that we do not know what the Taliban really wants. When I was U.S. ambassador to Pakistan, I heard a lot about territorial demands, basically Taliban governorships in the Pashtun South and East, and ministerial positions. Since I tended to hear this from ISI, it makes me think that that's what ISI wants, not necessarily what the Taliban wants. It may well be that the Taliban is more concerned about the administration of justice. Certainly it does not promote a separatist agenda, seen itself as having a national political role. As for the Constitution, there is a body of opinion that holds that the Taliban does not so much object to the substance of the current Afghan Constitution, but rather the exclusion of the group in the drafting process. Again, there is more we don't know about Taliban desiderata than what we do know, which to my mind, as a diplomat, is a good reason to get into negotiations. Any peace process will very quickly have to incorporate a regional dimension with the goal of minimizing hedging strategies. It must include Afghanistan's neighbors, certainly Pakistan, Iran, and China, but also Russia and India. Pakistan's role is pivotal. It can help to bring the Taliban to the table, or it can be a spoiler. Islamabad and Rawalpindi need to have an incentive for the process to succeed, so they should be early participants in the regional discussion. China has already demonstrated its commitment to a political settlement through its participation in the Quadrilateral Coordinating Group. Russia and Iran have made clear that they should be part of the process, and to prevent their adopting a spoiling stance, they also need to be included. India has a huge stake in regional stability. There will be questions of timing and sequencing of these discussions, which are probably best left to our diplomats on the scene. A last point on modalities. It seems to me that this process does need a facilitator, an international actor acceptable to and trusted by both sides that can steer the process through its inevitable ups and downs. The Norwegian role in the Colombian negotiations is an obvious example. And I'm certainly partial to Norwegian mediation. Very glad to see Ambassador Kayeda here today. But obviously the key participants get a vote. Finally, were a process like this to develop, it would still be vitally important for the United States and the international community to continue to harden the Afghan state, consolidating hard-fought gains that have been made over the past 16 years on the battlefield. The Taliban will only negotiate if they believe that they are unlikely to get what they want by fighting. So ironically, pursuing reconciliation, at least in the short term, looks somewhat similar to a long war strategy. Eventually, calibration of violence to reach a political effect may come into play. But for now, we have to make sure that the Afghan state is in the strongest position possible, which is why I support the call for increased troop levels. Having addressed the issue of diplomatic modalities, I suppose the key remaining question is, what is the formula? What is the actual terms that would allow Afghans, Americans, neighbors, and the international community to bring a conclusion to a 4-decade-long conflict? I think it would be reckless of me to try to answer that question, especially since we really do not know much about Taliban negotiating positions. But it seems to me that a plausible outcome is one in which the Taliban comes into the Afghan political system, probably by means of a loya jirga, which may change some elements of the Afghan constitution, but not the provisions affecting minority and women's rights. There would have to be a clear, unambiguous, and verified break with al-Qaeda. I would not rule out the possibility of some residual U.S. force levels, but clearly there would have to be some withdrawals. Without doubt, negotiations will be difficult, and as with any negotiation, we should be prepared to walk away from them if the deal is not good enough. So in conclusion, let me just make clear that I don't advocate peace talks with the Taliban because I have any sympathy for them. I don't. There is much that is reprehensible about the Taliban. Their penchant for brutality and indiscriminate violence, their medieval ideology and celebration of backward rural traditions, notably with regard to women. At a personal level, they have murdered 2 of my friends. But that does not change the strategic case for attempting to resolve the conflict. I do not underestimate the difficulty and perhaps even impossibility of reaching agreement, but fundamentally I arrive at the position of being in favor of a peace process because I think the other alternatives are either worse or unrealistic. General Petraeus, when he was ISAF commander, went on the record to say, to identify a political settlement as the end objective of our Afghan war. Indeed, every single senior military officer I have met sees this as the inevitable outcome. The key question is the one that Petraeus is said to have asked in Najaf, famously, in the spring of 2003 during a different war. How does this end? I see no other way than a political settlement and urge all that we get on with finding one before we have to find one. Thank you for your attention.
So I'll just ask Shmaila, who is the Senior Director for Afghanistan and Pakistan previously in the Obama administration, to offer some comments and critiques.
Okay, thank you, Samir. Thank you, Ambassador Olson and Stimson Center for hosting today. So I think what Ambassador Olson has given us today is a very nuanced analysis of all the stakeholders involved in what a political settlement would look like. He's analyzed kind of the interest from all different vantage points, both from the bilateral perspective of the Afghanistan-Pakistan relationship, but also from the regional perspective, and obviously from the vantage point of U.S. interests. And I didn't hear him saying the Taliban are bad guys, they're evil, we got to go after them, like that kind of vitriol and rhetoric that is very much part of this narrative. And
I did say they're bad guys.
but they are. You did say they're bad guys, but you said that we have to talk to them.
Yes.
And I think this is really important, and it reflects a set of experiences and understanding that the ambassador has from working in both countries at very high levels and with an intimacy that not everyone who participates in these debates has. And the U.S. Interagency has been afflicted by these kind of internal judgments or biases or perspectives for a long time, which I think has made it hard to move forward on what a political settlement looks like. So I think this perspective should be our baseline for moving forward. I agree very much with what the ambassador said. That being said, I've been asked to actually challenge some of his views today, which is hard because I don't actually think there's an alternative viewpoint to what he shared, and mostly because we've spent so much time on these issues, nearly over a decade, 16 years, and I don't think that we need to belabor some of these points and consider alternative viewpoints. I agree that the war needs to end with a political settlement, and the U.S. military has accepted this for some time now. But I'm going to take 3 kind of areas or questions and focus on those, largely because I do agree with the ambassador. But one is the U.S. ready to reconcile? 2, how do we structure the policy? And 3, what do we do about Pakistan? So first, I would say that we talk a lot about the Taliban being consolable. Are they ready? Should we talk to them? But we shouldn't forget to ask: is the United States ready to reconcile? And I'm thinking back to my time working in the Obama administration when we had considerable debates in the interagency over just the kind of the mere ideology of the Taliban and who they were and what they wanted. And in the lead up to the U.S.'s first meeting with Tayyip Aga, who at the time was Mullah Omar's political representative, there were considerable debate over kind of are the Taliban political stakeholders with pragmatic aims, or are they violent Islamic fundamentalists who'll never yield on their strict interpretation of Sharia law? I'd like to see where we are today on some of these fundamental issues within the U.S. system. I think that's kind of where you have to start if you're going to design a process. And I suspect that some of those views have hardened over time, mostly because we have been fighting for a long time. We've been fighting the Taliban, and even though we had no fundamental original sin with them or a quarrel, a lot has happened in this time. And so that's not lost on anyone. We shouldn't forget that. Furthermore, we haven't talked a lot about the lack of broad national support in Afghanistan for the Taliban, as well as the Ghani Abdullah divisions and the other Afghan political factions, which would, if you consider all of their interests and stakes, I think it does make reconciliation seem fairly bleak. But Ambassador Olson has rightly addressed these concerns for us already, noting that we pursue political settlements in spite of these differences because, simply put, this is how wars must end. So I think that's kind of the approach that we have to take, especially during this time of transition for the United States. We have an opportunity to look at a long war, an old conflict, in a fresh way. And so that brings me to my second question of how do we structure this policy? I mean, this is kind of what fascinates bureaucrats and what has made this issue actually quite enticing to work on for the past several years. So then a word on the design of the settlement, I think, is very much warranted. Who are the participants? What are the modalities and terms of that settlement? Those are the most complex kind of aspects of the reconciliation option. And I know that intel community in the U.S. has done a lot of analysis on kind of the different viewpoints of the Taliban, internally looking at the leadership, how they differ. There are factions within the leadership itself. But I think we need to do an equally kind of analytical study on the policy side and kind of build out or game it out, essentially. And I don't know that we had the privilege of doing that when we started the conversation about reconciliation in the early years of the Obama administration. We spent a considerable amount of time simply socializing the bureaucracy to the concept of reconciliation, that it wasn't a dirty word. So I think now is also a good time to look into some of those kind of gaming techniques. And also I thought that the short-term troop surges that we pursued in the Obama administration, our overly ambitious agenda with Pakistan, and also a weak regional strategy were really the specific factors that also inhibited reconciliation. And the ambassador mentioned some of these and noted that we have to be much more pragmatic about dealing with all of those issues, and I would agree with that. But the most important thing here on structuring the policy is that a settlement can only function and succeed if all aspects of U.S. policy in Afghanistan are built around that concept of political reconciliation. So it can't exist independently or be compartmentalized in this super secret kind of code word environment. It actually has to be, all of these policies of development, security assistance, train, advise, and assist have to be mechanisms that reinforce reconciliation. Right? So that basically means your number one priority in the U.S.-Afghanistan relationship is a settlement and reaching that. I think that's going to be hard to do, but if you can start intellectually with that point, we might be able to get somewhere. And third, finally, this is the hardest one, what to do with Pakistan. These are obviously issues that are very close to kind of my professional experience. We've tackled them for a long time. I agree 100% with Ambassador Olson that when Pakistan looks at Afghanistan, it sees India, and all of its actions are justified through that lens. And that's a fact and a reality that we're not going to challenge or reshape. So the kind of changing Pakistan's strategic calculus argument or policy, I think, is a thing of the past and should remain there. And I don't think that there's a lot of dispute in the U.S. government about that. But there is a view that I think is still out there that to address this, we might build Pakistan's strategic capabilities vis-a-vis India. If you can reduce the India-Pakistan climate of tension, that things might actually get better in Afghanistan. And I think we've tried that too with billions of dollars of FMF, CS coalition support funds, and there's still safe havens in Afghanistan or in Pakistan. So, we keep coming back to the issue of safe havens. And we also know that unilateral options don't really work in Pakistan. There are no good unilateral options, nor should we attempt to pursue them, because that's not the kind of relationship we want with Pakistan. And it's just not the kind of relationship that we should have in general with countries. And Ambassador Olson noted the dependency on Pakistan for air routes as well and land routes. So I think that further limits what the United States can do. So it brings me to the issue of orientation. The U.S. policy with Pakistan is schizophrenic. On the one hand, it's a bilateral relationship with many equities to consider. And on the other hand, it's one aspect of the U.S. policy with Afghanistan, a really difficult aspect. But could there be space in between those two divergent views for a compromise? I think there is space for that, but the only way to get there is through a settlement discussion or a political reconciliation process. And that is exactly what peace talks are meant to facilitate, are questions like these. And Pakistan is interested in the governance of the Afghan provinces on its border. There's obviously a political benefit there, but there are also economic and financial incentives working in the mind of the Pakistani establishment. And we shouldn't forget that the original Pakistani strategy of adopting the Taliban was partly rooted in a desire to have friendly routes into Central Asia and through the region. And so it's not based solely on Pashtun sympathies. So it's just something to keep in mind. I mean, we can talk about those things constructively and not in an antagonistic way, but in a process that's has to deal with negotiations, and we're kind of trying to figure out what the different interests of the stakeholders are. So I think these are governance issues, they're access issues, and if Pakistan were to be brought into that conversation at the right time, at the right level, and with the acceptance of the other stakeholders, I think you could have a much more constructive conversation about this. Although I might be too optimistic in this regard because I do know how challenging it is. So in general, I think to summarize, the Trump administration and those of you working on the policy now would be wise to pay attention to this issue of orientation. A policy review shouldn't just focus on troop increases, but it should focus on a conversation about what our objectives are in Afghanistan. And that's what I really see missing, and the ambassador alluded to that. The threat environment has morphed, and we often hear people saying, well, we have to stay for a long time because there are new enemies. ISIS is there, they're linking up with the Pakistani Taliban, with the Afghan Taliban, and it poses a greater threat to the region and to the United States, which I agree, but that doesn't mean we need a permanent presence that's military-centric or military-focused. It might mean a different kind of permanent presence, and a political settlement conversation can also facilitate that. What would a long-term presence for the U.S. look like that is not rooted in a basing strategy, right? So I think those are questions we really haven't gotten to or had the opportunity to talk about. And finally, somebody mentioned this being an election issue or coming up during the campaign, and I've been surprised that more Americans don't complain about how much money is going into Afghanistan. It's been well publicized. People know that we've been spending billions of dollars on this, but I continue to be amazed that this doesn't become the political issue that I anticipated it would. And so I have to believe that there's some kind of domestic constituency for long-term engagement in Afghanistan. There's some sympathy amongst the American people. There's an openness to wanting to see this country do well. I don't know that people would think that if they got into the nitty-gritty details of our relationship, but I do think that's there, and it's an opportunity for the United States to shape a better long-term policy, but it can't happen in lieu of reconciliation. It can only happen once that conversation opens up. So I'll leave that.
Ambassador, do you want to take a few minutes to respond? Or?
Sure. Thank you very much, Shamila. Let me see if I can take a crack at the three questions. Is the U.S. ready to reconcile? I don't know. It's a good question. First of all, to my mind, there has not been a clear statement of Afghanistan policy from the Trump administration. So I really don't know whether reconciliation would figure in such a policy statement. It's really not very clear to me what our Afghanistan policy is. As I said in my remarks, the debate has been, to the extent there's been a debate, it's been on the narrow question of whether General Nicholson should get more troops. But I will say that even when it was the policy of the Obama administration to pursue reconciliation, it was one line of effort amongst five. The five were enumerated by President Obama in his speech at Bagram in May of 2012. And I would note that not among those five is counterterrorism. So, that's separate and apart from counterterrorism policy globally. and as it impacts Afghanistan. So my feeling was a bit like Shamila's at an earlier stage in the discussion, was that reconciliation, even though it was formally a policy objective of the Obama administration, was never more than one line of effort, and in fact the other lines of effort tended to trump in almost every case. Certainly counterterrorism, but then really the other, at least three of the other four lines of efforts in Afghanistan almost always trumped reconciliation. And I'll come back to that, I guess, in terms of, well, that's a good segue into the second question, which is how should you structure the policy? And I agree completely, Shamila, that if you're going to succeed at reconciliation, I think it has to be the central objective of your policy. I don't think that it necessarily generates lines of conflict with the other policies. As I've indicated, you still have to harden the Afghan state. You still have to provide security assistance. You still have to be prepared to back the Afghans on the battlefield so that the Taliban has every incentive to come to the table. But over time, there are choices that will have to be made. And there may be choices about calibration of violence. And I say calibration of violence, I think that means ratchet up or ratchet down, not just ratcheting down. I'm not suggesting that because you have a peace process underway, you always necessarily then don't pursue that you put an end to the violence. You can't. The U.S. has a long history of having used military means to bring about specifically peace talks, successfully in the Balkans, less successfully in Vietnam. But I think that those are the full range of tools, but they have to be thought of in terms of advancing the end of a political settlement. It actually looks rather different if you prioritize reconciliation somewhat more highly. And as we were talking before, Shamila made a good point and made a point here at the table that the compartmentalization of our reconciliation policy has probably worked to its detriment. When I was actively involved in this process, I could only discuss it with probably 25 people in the U.S. government, and our broader objectives were everybody's property, and so there is a lot more discussion and consideration and measured debate on the military issues than there is probably on reconciliation. I'm not sure how you resolve that particular conflict, by the way, because obviously sensitive diplomacy requires discretion, and you can't be out there talking about it publicly. But I think that it does need to be a slightly wider aperture, perhaps. What to do with Pakistan? Well, that's a good question. I am a little skeptical of the idea that we have to somehow approach Pakistan through our India policy, which essentially means making progress on the thorny Kashmir issue in order to get progress in Afghanistan. And I don't see that as anything that can be done in the near term. I would be very cautious of getting into that. I think that I wish the Trump administration every bit of success and good luck with dealing with those set of issues. But the fact is, I don't see the structure in place right now with either the Modi government or the Nawaz government to bring about a dramatic improvement in Indo-Pak relations. The high point of Indo-Pak relations was probably under Musharraf, when Musharraf had a plan for Kashmir that actually involved de-emphasizing, it was kind of a European Union solution, if you will, de-emphasizing the importance of the border rather than addressing the question of the border. I think it's very far from imagining anyone making that kind of an initiative right now. So I think you have to deal with Pakistan and Afghanistan as they are now. And what I think that means is that it is important to pursue a reconciliation process that helps to address Pakistan's desiderata, but you can't let Pakistan dominate the peace process, because the inevitable consequence of that is to suggest, and this is why the Quad failed, in my view, is to suggest that the Taliban are in fact a wholly owned subsidiary of Pakistan, which I don't believe they are at the end of the day. Yes, they're supported by Pakistan. Yes, they have safe haven. They have strategic advantages. But Pakistan, I do not believe, quite genuinely, can order all of the Taliban to make peace or frankly, to do much of anything else. So, and I think creating a diplomatic construct in which you rely upon that is ultimately probably going to fail, because the Taliban do have a vote in all of this. So I think we have to address Pakistan's concerns, and I think that getting a reconciliation process underway under American leadership or with American leadership would take a lot of wind out of a lot of regional sails and would help to address some of the fundamental problems that cause the hedging strategy that all of the regional players have adopted.
Great. I'm going to take the prerogative of the moderator just to pose a question as well. So Ambassador Olson and also Shmaila. So we've talked a lot about this idea that there's a stalemate, or at least going to be a somewhat durable stalemate. But I think one of the key insights from a lot of the academic literature on civil wars is that stalemates are not sufficient for reconciliation, negotiation, settlement process, but it has to be a hurting stalemate specifically. So I guess my question is, do we see that happening? Because it looks like from the outside that for the last 15 years, people have been saying the Afghan people and presumably participants in the war are war weary, and yet it's been going on for 15 years on top of, as you said, multiple decades of civil war. So is it a hurting stalemate? Do we see it going in that direction? And if not, how do we change that?
Well, I guess I would give a slightly different take. I mean, I respect the academic literature on this, but and I would not argue, and I didn't argue in my remarks, that this is a situation that is immediately ripe for resolution. I don't think that's the case. I think, unfortunately, we are going to have, under any scenario, more fighting ahead. But I would argue that getting some kind of process going in which there is a peace process underway will have positive effects on the dynamic. First of all, I do think that within there is the generalized war weariness of the Afghan populace, which I think ultimately may be some kind of factor in this. I think within the Taliban, there is probably some kind of peace camp, if that's not too grand a term, but certainly people who value international respectability and recognize that they will only get that international respectability through some kind of peace process. And if they are empowered within the organization, it is then possible that that sort of thinking will begin to spread. But fundamentally, I think we shouldn't kid ourselves that this is going to take some time, and I think this is another reason why I would support General Nicholson and General Votel's call for more troops, because the worst thing for reconciliation right now would be for the Taliban to think that they can get everything that they want on the battlefield, and they need to know that that can't happen.
Just real quick, I would say that I agree. I would also support request for additional troops, not a major surge, but part of the reason I think we're in this situation is that it's been widely perceived by the Taliban and regional countries that the U.S. is on the back foot for several years now, and I think what we're seeing kind of this resurgence of Taliban kind of activity, as well as ISIS, and AFPAC relations are really weak right now, and other countries are getting more involved in the region. This is all the result of the perception that U.S. leadership will be minimized in the region, as well as the troop presence. And so I would agree with the ambassador that we have to kind of reinforce that, the optics, but also in practice, that we plan to be there for some time so that they will hurt.
Great. All right, so we're going to open up to question and answers. Let me give you a few housekeeping rules. Please wait for the microphone to come to you. When you receive the microphone, identify yourself and your affiliation, and please also just ask one question. And because I know there are a number of reporters in the room who are on deadline, I'm just going to give that first round to reporters who have any questions. If not, we'll just open up to general questions. Reporters? Okay, general questions. Sir, start with you.
Doug Brooks with the Afghan-American Chamber of Commerce. Obviously, a key player in this, as you mentioned, is Pakistan. I just wonder what sort of forms of leverage we have on Pakistan that we can actually pull. What sort of effective buttons do we have?
Well, as I said in my remarks, I think the Pakistanis are well aware of the leverage that they do have over us. Especially, given the geography in Afghanistan being a landlocked country. I am personally somewhat skeptical that we have a lot of leverage that we've been able, that we can, and I just say that based on experience. It has not been the case that our assistance, which in some cases we did apply conditionality to, was able to deliver the results that we hoped. And I think that if anything, our potential for leverage has been diminished by the fact that Pakistan believes that it has struck the jackpot with the Chinese, and that you have the China-Pakistan economic corridor going through, talk of $46 billion. Now, I don't think all of that is going to materialize in quite the way that some of the more heady Pakistani supporters of CPEC think it is. But nonetheless, at the moment, I think it diminishes even further the importance of reaching accommodation with the United States. Fundamentally, I think Pakistan, the establishment, sees the Taliban as a core strategic asset. And I don't think there's much that the United States could do to get them to change a core strategic perception. We could get them to change their views on things that are less important to them, but on a core strategic issue, I think our leverage is pretty limited. I'm all in favor of trying, by the way. I mean, the trend seems to be that we're going to take a harsher line towards Pakistan. That may make us feel better, but I don't think it's going to work.
Yeah, I think pressure, you said leverage, but I'm thinking pressure. And pressure really only works if there's a reaction to it. And we've tried to pressure the Pakistanis through various policies and mechanisms. The relationship with India and the United States is actually one avenue of pressure on the Pakistanis that some thought would yield greater results in Afghanistan or on the Taliban issue, and that hasn't really resulted in anything. And so I think that the problem is actually our conversation is focused on leverage and pressures, and what really needs to happen now after 16 years is a very blunt, direct conversation about what Pakistan's interests are and what the United States' interests are as part of this reconciliation discussion. We really haven't gotten to that level yet, and I don't think that our folks in the field have been empowered to have those kinds of conversations.
Great.
I have to commit. I'm not sure I agree with that, actually, Shamil. I mean, I met with Raheel, who had General Raheel, the Pakistan Army chief, had the Afghan account explicitly for the Nawaz government, and in fact, the Army chiefs have always had the Afghanistan account. I had 50-plus conversations with him that were very direct and very candid on this. And there was no hesitation under the Obama administration about having direct conversations, and indeed even tying some of our assistance to specific actions which didn't happen. So I think we have to take almost as a fact that Pakistan is going to continue to support the Taliban, and we have to make the best of that we can.
Okay, I'm going to go around the room. Sir. One second.
My name is Mike Albin. I'm an independent independent researcher. Mr. Ambassador, I want to refer to a phrase in your article here in front of me. The Afghan conflict is between rural traditionalists and urban modernizers. Is that a correct way of phrasing the conflict in Afghanistan, leaving out ethnicities and so forth?
Well, I leave it to greater academic minds than mine to say whether it's correct or not. It is certainly my view of the thread that has predominated across 40 years of Afghan history. And if you look at all the way back to 1979, the uprising, the initial uprising, was led, of course, against the communist regime in Kabul by one Ismail Khan, who is, of course, himself a Tajik. And I think that the Taliban happens to right now embody the values of rural Afghanistan, but I don't think actually their sway is entirely Pashtun. There's a huge element of Pashtun nationalism and identity to this, without any question, and it's more complex than a purely rural versus urban. But I think the characteristic thing that you've seen over many years across the broad range of Afghan history is that conflict coming to the fore. And I think it's particularly relevant right now because you essentially do have a dynamic underway in which the Taliban are, I would say, increasingly ascendant in rural areas, and not just in the south, and not just in the east. And there's no question that the government controls the population centers, as General Nicholson points out. The government controls 70% territory that has 70% of the population. And Afghanistan is now a much more urbanized society than it has ever been in its past. And that is the hope of Afghanistan, frankly. But what it means is that the Taliban, which measures its own success by how it's doing in rural areas, is able to see themselves in a way as perhaps winning and don't feel that they're at a hurting stalemate yet.
All right, let's go with Seema. Sorry, I'm making you guys move a lot. We've got very efficient, precise questions thus far. Let's keep it up. Yeah, Seema.
Seema Sirohi, I'm a columnist for Indian newspapers. Ambassador Olson, you say that the U.S. has no leverage over Pakistan. That's kind of a statement that I wouldn't have expected given the billions of dollars that you give Pakistan. I wanted your comment on the fact that the U.S. never actually applied the conditions it had in the laws, and that you gave them a national security waiver every time. So I'd like your comment on that. And my other question is about the strategy. Senator McCain said that the U.S. has a don't lose strategy rather than a win strategy in Afghanistan.
Okay. Well, if I said that the U.S. has no leverage with Pakistan, that was probably an overstatement. What I do believe is that the United States does not have sufficient leverage to overcome what Pakistan believes to be its core national interest and its core strategic interest. I think that's a more precise way to formulate it. And I think that they have chosen to define support for Afghanistan and some kind of droit de regard over how Afghanistan develops as being a core strategic interest. And that has to do with their perceptions of India. I don't think their perceptions are correct with regard to India, by the way, but that doesn't matter. It's their perceptions, not ours. So I am somewhat skeptical that by applying greater conditionality, we can get a renunciation of a core policy for the Pakistani state. I don't object to trying. I mean, it may be worth doing that. I would just point out that while our assistance levels are not insignificant, they never have been. At the high point of Kerry Lugar Berman, we were contributing about 1% of Pakistan's GDP. As I said, the Chinese are now, at least in the Pakistani minds, contributing 46 billion, a much more significant number. And I think they feel they have other options to turn to. But I have no objection in principle to attempting a tougher line with Pakistan. I think we did try it at the tail end of the Obama administration, and I didn't see any particular effect. You mentioned Senator McCain's comment about having a don't lose strategy rather than a win strategy. Well, look, as I think I've made clear in my remarks, I find it very difficult to see winning a victory in Afghanistan in purely military terms. I mean, I find that a very difficult concept to get my head around because essentially of the problem that we've been talking about, the safe havens, the fact that the Taliban can, at the end of the day, retreat across the border and be immune from military effects. And that situation effectively means to me that a military solution is ultimately not possible. But I do think that hardening the Afghan state and supporting the Afghan state against the Taliban is something that we absolutely have to do, while I would argue pursuing a political settlement. And others might argue for a long war.
I just want to comment on you pointed out conditions. This is really important to bring up because the U.S. has waived many times kind of conditions on the security assistance and based on Pakistan's, the conditions focused on Pakistan's relationship with the Haqqani network or LET or other militant groups. And this is a part of the relationship that, we have to acknowledge that it's there, that in many cases the U.S. has weighed the, pros and cons of doing a waiver or not. And we've come out, of the view that, we shouldn't hold these conditions on Pakistan because the kind of cooperation the United States gets in Afghanistan is much more important from the Pakistanis in terms of the routes and supplies for the troops. So I think that's the main reason for that. And we have to keep that in mind. Once our troop presence changes, I do think that opens up a question, and I anticipate that there will be some space in the conversation about security assistance to get a little bit more specific on what the United States expects of Pakistan in terms of counterterrorism cooperation. And while it's probably not a good idea to focus on a national security strategy that's not going to change, and I agree with the ambassador there, I do think there's an opportunity to look at how we might itemize the security assistance budget that the United States has been giving Pakistan to get better short-term tactical gains that we might want out of the Pakistanis.
Great. So let's go to the gentleman right next to Seema. And again, I'll just reiterate to ask a question, not a statement.
Thank you. My name is Bilal Hay, and I am from the Embassy of Pakistan. Thank you very much, Ambassador Olson, for your comprehensive talk. And before I would ask my question, I'm forced to make a brief comment, and that is
very, very brief.
You mentioned about the presence of safe havens and sanctuaries, and we know that this is a long time complaint that we have heard from the U.S., but I believe that there has been a while that you left the office. Probably there are certain developments that you need to be updated in. And I would like to inform the audience that our new ambassador who recently joined the office, he made a public statement about these issues, a very detailed public statement which is available on record, and anybody could have access to that file for information. But my question, Ambassador Olson, is that you argued in favor of reconciliation as a viable option to resolve the conflict in Afghanistan, and you have shown your preference to pick up one of the very multiple peace processes that have been tried for Afghanistan. And I would like to know why you prefer to revive the Doha process despite its difficult history. And we know that there are other processes which had actually delivered something concrete with at least one QCG process that I would like to mention, which was able to have the first ever public contact between Taliban and the Afghan government. And there was a lot of homework behind the scenes, roadmap developed, and before the second meeting, the scheduling of the second meeting, it had to be postponed because of certain unfortunate news leaks. So why do you think that Doha process has more chances compared to others? Thank you.
First of all, let us correct the record here. The first talks that you're referring to, the Murray talks, took place in the summer of 2015. It was actually before the formation of the Quadrilateral Coordinating Group, although that's a distinction without a difference because it was the same parties. Pakistan, Afghanistan, U.S., China, and in this case, certain Taliban representatives. That process did offer promise, and that is why we pursued it. It's actually why we set up the QCG at the Heart of Asia Summit in Islamabad in December of 15. And we pursued it, I think, as aggressively as we could. But the Taliban actually refused to come to the table. They had come to Murray, but they refused publicly and repeatedly to come to the table with the QCG. And I think my analysis of that is because they perceived that the QCG was a U.S.-Chinese condominium to get Pakistan to get the Taliban to come to the table, which is probably not an inaccurate analysis. And so they did not want to be perceived as being an agent of Pakistan. So I think for that reason, it makes sense to engage directly with the Taliban, but I am fully in favor of engaging all the regional parties, first and foremost Pakistan, in a process, and I think that is absolutely essential.
Richard?
Richard Ponzio with the Stimson Center. I was going to ask about CPEC China putting pressure on Pakistan, but that's been covered. So let me ask an admittedly difficult question about concessions that Afghanistan may have to entertain when there are formal negotiations that we all hope to see. It seems to be that the Taliban is, if anything, emphasized on political power. So does it come down to a few ministerial portfolios, governorships in the south or southeast? And we have another round of elections coming up in a few years, both National Assembly and the presidential election. How should that factor in, if at all, in negotiations?
Yeah, well, it's an excellent question, Richard. And as I said, I don't think we know what the Taliban really are actually going to negotiate for. I mean, we're kind of reading their public statements, and I am personally a little bit skeptical of this idea that it's going to be simply, a number of ministerial positions and governorships. I think they may have greater ambitions, frankly, and I think that the goal should be to get them to go into some sort of to emerge as some kind of political party, and I think it will take probably Aloya Jirga to actually bring that about, and I think that would be probably the mechanism that would be necessary. To some extent, the deal that the government has already concluded, at least in principle with Hekmatyar, does offer, some outlines for what the government might be prepared to do in the context of negotiations. And I think this is where it will get very difficult, because this is where the ethnic question will come to the fore. And I think that Dr. Abdullah has been supportive of the reconciliation process in general terms so far, but I think that his constituency, his base, is going to be much more affected than Dr. Ghani's, and so that's going to require some really, really careful management.
Just one small point. When we think concessions, we often go to political concessions first, but I also would kind of advise people to keep paying attention to kind of the human security concerns when concessions with the Taliban are discussed. There is a large community in the United States that's interested in civil society and human rights in Afghanistan, and that hasn't gone away, and that was one of kind of the key stakeholders in the kind of the early stages of the relationship with the U.S. as well, and during the Soviet occupation. So I think that's something we have to kind of keep in mind when we look at settlement and concessions, and then also regional security considerations as we track the activities of ISIS and other groups and their ability to operate in South Asia. What does a Taliban-run government or parts of a Taliban-run government, how do they interact with these transnational actors that really weren't there in the same way 16 years ago? And I think that has to be discussed when looking at concessions.
Shall I bring over this way, sir?
Thank you, Ludwig Blaurock, for the European Union here in DC. Thank you very much, Ambassador. And I'd like to say we certainly agree as a European Union that peace and reconciliation should be the way to go, and we're a very strong proponent of it. And since we've been talking quite a bit about the regional aspects, and there again, the Union would be very happy and willing to support that. I think just to follow up what we discussed on the earlier question right now is about the core peace negotiation needed between the Afghan government and the Taliban. We have not discussed the other part of it is how far, how do you assess, is the Afghan government itself ready and prepared to actually enter those negotiations, and how clear do they have internally a vision of where they want to end up?
Yeah, that's a good question, and let me preface this by saying that I have been out of this business since November 15th, and that's a long time in political terms, and so I would not pretend to know what the latest thinking is in Kabul on reconciliation issues. But my guess is, and I think is that it's probably the mood is somewhat sour given the fall of Sangin and the threat to Lashkar-Gah, and we are coming into the fighting season. And so I suspect that it will not be the time when the Afghan government will be thinking about making gestures for the sake of peace. I mean, this is the challenge of this dynamic, is that you have to, from a diplomatic standpoint, you have to that sort of moment when both sides feel that they have an incentive to come to the table, and that's sort of not when either side is clearly militarily ascendant. That said, my experience with all those caveats was that the Afghan government was committed to reconciliation. I think that President Ghani was very committed to it, and I think that Dr. Abdullah was committed in principle, but I think that he had some natural reservations, as I think his base, his political base does, about where things are headed. But I think they recognize that, like most people who have looked at this situation do recognize that this has to some point end in a settlement, and it's a question of getting the best settlement possible.
I'm going to try to bundle a few questions, and I'll help keep track of them. So, yes, sir.
My name is Andy Stewart. My question has to do with compromise. Why would the Taliban compromise on their core values? If they were to accept your women's rights and those things, wouldn't that not make them the Taliban? The other part is, why should Pakistan compromise on its need for strategic depth? There are many who believe that Pakistan support would be better gained if Afghanistan were more aligned. There's a perception that Afghanistan is too aligned with India.
Why don't we just go over here to Matt and throw another question?
Matt Deering, National Defense University. How serious do you see Russia's current engagement with the Taliban, and do you see this pushing the overall reconciliation process forward or backward?
Why don't we take those and
Okay. So why would the Taliban compromise on their core values? Again, I'm not sure how much we really know about what the Taliban would define as their core values. Some of them would say that their measures with regard to women were and women's rights were, particular to the exigencies of the 1990s, and that they have a more enlightened view. I don't know that I wouldn't take that at face value. But I do think that the value of peace may, at the end of the day, be more important to them. And again, I think if they can, or at least a political arrangement that allows them to function more openly, and a measure of international respectability. So I think these are all things that are going to have to be negotiated very hard. The bigger question is whether the Taliban would be, prepared to really come and engage and seek a process. And this gets to the question of a hurting stalemate. I'm not sure that they're there yet, but hopefully over time those conditions will emerge. On Pakistan, I don't think it's a question so much, at least from the American perspective, of getting Pakistan to compromise on the question of strategic depth. It is, in my view, about us showing leadership to get a dynamic going in the region that everyone ultimately has to accept. That is to say that if you get a peace process going between Afghans that is genuine and has a degree of regional support, I think that will undermine Pakistan's ability to be a spoiler in this regard. Now, if Pakistan wants to be a spoiler, it can always be a spoiler. But getting a peace process going, essentially, I would argue for stealing a march on Pakistani policy, essentially, in this regard. And then, how serious is Russia engagement with the Taliban? I'm not sure it's all that serious, but I do think that they do see an opening right now to insert themselves and to work against the United States. They perceive, not correctly, but they do perceive the U.S. Having a military stronghold in Afghanistan as being a threat to them. I think that's kind of crazy. When I was in Moscow, I pointed out we had 18 F-16s in the country. It didn't represent. I was asked by the Russian press really about why we were building all these strategic bomber bases in Afghanistan, and I said no, we were using the Russian ones actually, but but we had 18 F-16s. So I think it's part of a more generalized approach, and I think that they have had to work through the Iranians, who are also very strange bedfellows for the Taliban, but it just shows the importance of hedging strategies in the region. So I would argue for American leadership in this area simply to close down what is, I think, a nascent and not very, an unhelpful but not terribly strong Russian line of effort.
Just a point on the Taliban compromise. Some of the early conversations in the United States on reconciliation and with the Taliban showed that they were definitely tired and suffering from war fatigue and wanted to be out more freely and less beholden to kind of the regional stakeholders that were involved in the Afghanistan conflict, Pakistan, but others as well. And I think I just lost my thought there. there was a moment in the reconciliation process where one of the ministers actually had an interview with a journalist. Do you remember this?
No.
It was, I think it was BBC or something, and it was a part of our conversations with them to have them show us that they were willing to kind of adjust and that they weren't these fundamentalist ideologues. It was rather funny, actually, to see this Taliban minister speak with this female journalist, right? But that was kind of to me, I psychoanalyze that as, okay, they know that they have to enter the modern world, and they've been out of it for so long, and the region has changed. There are so many other countries that are involved in a very intimate way. The Indians have been pumping tons of money into Afghanistan. The Russians are involved always. The Chinese are there, and the Americans are there, and we're going to stay there. So there are a lot of new checks and balances on Taliban activity now that weren't there a decade ago. So I think even if they were to enter a government in a formal way, we wouldn't see a repeat of the 90s in the same way because of these dynamics.
And I think there's a good paper by Michael Semple and Theo Farrell that just came out on this topic. All right, let's collect 3 more. I'll get to everyone, don't worry. So we'll start with Mr. Ambassador here.
Thank you. My name is Kai Eide from Norway. The Russian engagement. Of course, the reason often given is the presence of IS in Afghanistan and Central Asia. Could you comment on that as a part of the Russian rationale? And secondly, could you expand, Ambassador, a little bit on what you said? Because not only do you argue a reconciliation policy, but you are saying that the peace and reconciliation element should then be the central element in the U.S. policy. Could you expand a little bit on that latter part? Thank you.
All right, I'm going to take another 1 or 2 questions over here, and then we'll go to you.
Thank you. I'm Chris Bidwell from the Federation of American Scientists. We talked a lot about the reconciliation and the interests of Pakistan, but there's some other neighbors that may have some interest in this reconciliation too, namely Iran and the northern stance. I was wondering how they might be helpful or not helpful in reconciliation discussions, if you can hazard a guess on that. Thank you.
Great. And we'll just go to this woman in the back.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Kamal Abdi. I'm a reporter, and I am covering Trump administration from White House and Pentagon both. So my question is laser focused on what to do about Pakistan. And before I put in my question, I would like to refer to a readout of Secretary Defense Jim Mattis with he had a call with the Army Chief General Bajwa, and he was all in praise, and it's on record. And he really praised the bilateral military to military relations. And on the other side is Congressman Poe, Republican from Texas. He's working on a bill about alleging Pakistan to make it a state-sponsored terrorism bill. The ma'am would be knowing about it because last year, HR 6069, Congressman Poe introduced a bill and titled Pakistan State Sponsor of Terrorism, and he has reproduced that same bill under the HR 1449 on March 9th. So my question now to both of you, what should Trump administration do about Pakistan policy, keeping in mind the military point of view and the lobby in the Congress? Thank you. And my last question to Honorable...
We have got 4 questions on the docket.
Okay,
So let's
thank you.
Ambassador, you want to
Okay.
take a crack at it?
Okay. On the question of Russian motivation, I think they probably are genuinely concerned about the development of Daesh in Afghanistan. But I think that their response to it has been counterproductive to the aims that they're trying to achieve. I mean, I think that the best way to deal with the threat that emerges from Daesh is to reinforce and harden the Afghan state, and they have done a little bit of that. But I think they have also attempted to build some links to the Taliban and tried to, if anything, encourage the Taliban to fight with Daesh. And that's proxy warfare of the type that has driven Afghanistan into the state that it is in for the last 40 years. You ask about what it means to make reconciliation the central element of U.S. policy. I would just argue that you have to decide, whatever your policy is towards Afghanistan, you have to decide what the objective is. And then you make the objective the central point of your policy. As I said, I have yet to meet a senior military officer, a general, who doesn't believe that this war will end in a political settlement, including General Petraeus and every one of the commanders subsequent to him. So if that's the case, and that's your objective, then that should really be your central objective, and it means that the other lines of effort should be in support of that objective. Now, as a practical matter, that on a day-to-day basis, that may or may not make a difference, but it does over time. And I think to cite one example, decapitating the leadership. If you had a policy debate about the impact on reconciliation, it might have been a different sort of debate if reconciliation had been the central policy. Okay. The question of Iran and the stands. I think Iran, like Russia, has real doubts about our staying power, and of course they don't like the U.S. presence in Afghanistan, although I think they're accommodated to it. Unfortunately, what has happened is, I think at the beginning of the war in Afghanistan, Iran saw the U.S. as a lesser evil than the Taliban, and I think that may have shifted over time, and I think they have been prepared to truck with the Taliban in a limited sort of way. And facilitate Russian contacts with the Taliban. So I would argue from a policy perspective what this means is that we should take away that opportunity for them to show leadership on reconciliation issues by showing leadership ourselves on reconciliation issues, because I think it will take away the regional, if we get a reconciliation process going, it will remove some of the need for hedging strategies or the ability of regional states to pursue hedging strategies. The question on Pakistan, I think, I laid out pretty clearly that Pakistan has a very strongly held position on the Taliban, even if it's not always articulated publicly, as we saw today. I don't think it particularly makes sense to designate Pakistan as a state sponsor of terrorism, because I don't see where that leads anywhere in terms of increasing our influence or indeed our ability to continue our war in Afghanistan, where, as I said, Pakistan holds some very important advantages with regard to the United States. So I think, in part, I arrive at the position of being strongly in favor of the U.S. government taking the lead on reconciliation and pursuing a reconciliation policy as a central objective, precisely because that helps to address this question of Pakistan and what to do about Pakistan and to get a more productive relationship with Pakistan.
All right, going to take one last round. Start with the gentleman over here, and we'll work this way. Again, questions, not preambles.
Thank you. My name is Zafar Hashmi. I'm a political counselor at the Embassy of Afghanistan. And thank you finally for giving the floor for an Afghan to offer an Afghan perspective.
Perspective, a question.
Yes. achievement that this government, Afghan government, had so far on the reconciliation process in Afghanistan is the definition of the problem. And that is that Taliban are not an insurgency. It is a terrorist organization with terrorist activities. And the other achievement, tangible achievement that Afghanistan had so far is the fact that Pakistan is at a state of undeclared hostility toward Afghanistan. This is something that has been proven over and over again. What we don't want to do is to continue this policy of continuation of this policy of appeasement of Pakistan by the United States, because Taliban are engage in activities and in attacks that not only target Afghanistan and Afghan interests, but also American interests. They cooperate with Daesh, they cooperate with Haqqani Network, which is both of which are recognized as terrorist organizations by the United States government. So what we can do and what we should do is to recognize Taliban for what they are, a terrorist organization. And for Pakistan, instead of pursuing and continuation of this policy of appeasement, is to know it for what it does, is supporting its proxies in Afghanistan, allowing terrorist organizations and their leadership, namely Quetta and Peshawar councils, roam in its territory for free.
Okay, we get the point. So
Yes.
is there a question here, or we can respond to that? But is there a question?
The question is, why should we continue the policy of appeasement toward
Sure.
Pakistan when it's not working?
Great. Rich, you had a question here?
Yeah, thanks.
Hold on, let's wait for the mic real quick.
Thank you, Richard Cronin from the Stimson Center. Of all the, lots of good arguments for reconciliation, and I can see we've all centered on that as a way to go, but it seems that the granularity of Afghanistan is such an obstacle. It's not just Tajiks and not Tajiks and Pashtuns or the Taliban in Kabul, etc. There's so many other power centers, and then you have the external actors. So, but the one new thing has been brought up by Mike initially and been commented on is the urbanization and the modernization that's come with that, and in addition, the sort of acceptance of a kind of rough procedural democracy. And so those are three positive things that trump a lot of the granularity. But the question is, what can the U.S. if you agree to this? What can the U.S. do to promote this, to push it further in terms of a real shift in U.S. policy and priorities? Is that a feasible way to think about the question? Thank you.
I'll go with this gentleman here, and we'll wrap it up.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Shamila and Samir. Ruhollah Osmania, I'm a visiting scholar, a colleague of Shamila at SAIS. We talked about safe havens, everyone talked about it. One thing that was not touched upon was the source of income for these safe havens to function, and the role of other regional countries in Gulf and Saudi Arabia that those fundraisers travel to fundraise for their efforts. So how do you think, Ambassador, the current administrations, given their relationship, as it seems apparently right now, a good relationship with Gulf states and Saudi Arabia, how that will play a sort of pressuring them, and also banning those fundraisers from those safe havens to go fundraise through travel bans and other sort of pressures?
Okay, so we've got a number of questions on the table. We'll take this.
Okay, so on the first question, I mean, I fully respect the views of Afghans in this regard because of what they have had to live through, and I can certainly understand the feelings were expressed. I guess my question is, it's the Petraeus question. How does this end? And labeling the Taliban as terrorists and getting into a confrontation with Pakistan, they may make us feel good. They may help to restore our manhood. They don't, really solve the problem. I don't think, realistically. I really don't. I mean, I'm all in favor of it if people want to try, but I don't think at the end of the day it's going to work. And I think that this conflict is likely to end in a political settlement at some point. The question is on whose terms and when, where, and how. And I guess that leads logically into the second question about urbanization. Yes, Afghan society has changed, and there have been significant improvements over the last 16 years. And I think that we have to continue to support it. But, you know, if I'm very candid here, my great concern is not that the U.S. cannot sustain a long war in Afghanistan. It is that at the end of the day, we will not sustain a long war in Afghanistan because there will be competing priorities. We will have to do military operations somewhere else. And, you know, the demands on Transcom, on simply the logistics of maintaining an army in landlocked Central Asia are such that I think that over time, it will call into question, you know, I don't doubt our political commitment, and we've made a political commitment to Afghanistan. I question whether, over time, the U.S. really will be able to live up to that commitment. Perhaps that's too cynical. Perhaps I underestimate our stamina in this regard, but given the difficulties of the operation, the fundamentally hostile cultural environment in some ways in which we operate, I really have questions about it. So that's why I think we should pursue the opportunity now to be working towards reconciliation. On the question of the funding of the Taliban, you know, in principle, I agree with you, although I suspect the flows from the Gulf are not really the core of what keeps the Taliban going. It's the drug trade that keeps the Taliban going, and it's their control of the drug trade. And you know, this is a problem. The Taliban has become entrenched over the course of many decades, and it has controls the drug trade out of Helmand. And it controls certain business operations in Pakistan, and there are Pakistanis who benefit from this, including official Pakistanis. And all of these things have to be undone. And I think that, yes, there should be further efforts on the part of our Gulf allies to crack down on funding. And I think we've had some progress in that area, but there's probably more that can be done.
Just on the big picture question of what to do with Pakistan, I mean, I think the ambassador and I both tried to get at the heart of that, and it's a tough question. And any conversation about Afghanistan is going to get to this issue of appeasement. I don't think it's going to change fundamentally. Look at all the kind of conflicts that have happened between the U.S. and Pakistan in the past 16 years, some of them on Afghanistan, some of them bilateral, and the relationship has kind of trudged along, and they've absorbed kind of the issues and the tensions and the problems related to each of these conflicts, but the relationship doesn't end, right? And I think that's a part of this narrative that also needs to go away, is that what are we going to do about them? Is this going to end? Do we actually make Pakistan a state sponsor of terrorism? I mean, these are extremist views that don't actually serve or advance U.S. interests, because we have to ask to what end. And so I think that's not a constructive way of making policy. Now, you're going to keep hearing these views from Congress, because the job of Congress is to provide oversight, and they're reacting. So extremist views like Pose are actually reacting to, you know, the fact that we have offered waivers for certain policies and we haven't enforced conditions on assistance, and there's something real in that conversation. And so to offer a starting point would be to look at the security assistance. That's what I care about the most, because those are taxpayer dollars. I'm paying for that. Am I getting my money's worth when we're giving billions of dollars to the Pakistanis? Probably not. So I think that could be a very tangible, cogent agenda item for the Trump administration to focus on, and that could get us somewhere.
Great. Well, thank you all for joining us. I want to thank Ambassador Olson for impressive remarks, and Shmaila Chaudhry for her discussion as well. And thank you all for joining us. I want to thank the South Asia team for all their work, Jim, Akriti, Miles, Will, and all the Simpson interns for making this event possible. Thanks again.